Howdy, I'm Kate Kavanaugh, and you're listening to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast, where we're laying the groundwork for our land, ourselves, and for generations to come by looking at the way every thread of life is connected to one another. Communities above ground mirror the communities below the soil, which mirror the vast community of the cosmos. As the saying goes, as above, so below. Join me as we take a curious journey into agriculture, biology, history, spirituality, health, and so much more. I can't wait to unearth all of these incredible topics alongside you. Hello, and welcome to the Mind, Body, and Soil / Groundwork podcast, forever in transition, though we might actually get there soon. I'm your host, Kate Kavanaugh, and on this podcast, we are exploring the threads of what it means to be humans woven into this earth. My guest this week is John Seabrook, whose book, The Spinach King, details his family's rise to being the Henry Ford of farming. It is the rise and fall of an American dynasty around frozen vegetables. And in it, we journey through many different agricultures, starting in the late 1800s with horse-drawn power and early vegetable farming in New Jersey, all the way into the mechanization and assembly line form of farming, into what comes to be known as the market garden state, New Jersey, and into cold storage, into truck farming, into road building, into overhead irrigation, into flash freezing and freeze drying, and DuPont's Mylar bag of peas that you could boil. You could boil the peas in the bag. And greenhouses being fumigated with cyanide gas post-World War II, into labor unions and the rise of the salad. This is a book that takes us many unexpected places. It certainly took me many unexpected places, but within that, it is also very much about intergenerational trauma. It is about the trauma that we inherit and that we pass on. And our guide through all of this is John Seabrook, who was the grandson of the main guy, a former guest of the podcast, Nicola Twilley, who wrote the incredible book Frostbite. You can listen to her podcast episode called Spinach King, the succession of vegetable farming. Succession, but make it spinach. And so John was left with his family's archives and his family's history to sort through, and to bring this story that honestly is incredibly relevant to where we find ourselves now to light. And as you'll hear John in this interview, he says that he wrote this book for the living and really liked that. I did want to pause and I want to read you this incredible passage, just to really drive home how wild this book is. And so this passage, we find ourselves at the harvesting of peas for freezing at the height of World War II. And wow. I think there are many reasons to read this book, but some of these descriptions of how our food system became so industrialized and what that industrialization looked like is absolutely incredible. John writes, in the early summer of 1943, Mona Gardner, a writer from Coronet magazine, visited Seabrook Farms during the pea harvest. A vegetable blitzkrieg, the pea harvest involved 150 tractors with mowers, 410 trucks, 150 viners, and 4 airplanes. All 10 of the company's divisions — farming, processing, packing, production, raw product, prepared foods, manufacturing, engineering, research, and purchasing — had to operate in sync not only with each other, but with the rapidly ripening crop. First, the tractors dragged mowers through the pea fields, laying the vines into windrows. A loader ran over the windrows and spewed them onto the flatbed dump trucks, which drove over to a viner, a huge, very loud machine that separated the pea pods from the stems and leaves. The latter were fed to the company's 1,000-head herd of beef cattle. They turned it into fertilizer for future crops. The unshelled peas were then loaded onto elevators and lifted 4 stories high to be fed into hoppers and then, successively, to a sheller, a chaff cleaner, a stone remover, and a size grater. At the end of that sorting process, the peas went through a steam tunnel to blanch them, and then a chilled brine solution to stop them from cooking further. The heavier peas sank in the brine, and the lighter ones, which would be packaged as extra fancy grade, floated on the surface. From there, flumes of water carried the vegetables further downstream to moving conveyor belts where female plant workers stood by to remove any remaining refuse. In C.F. Seabrook's view, women made better sorters than men. Then the peas entered the quick freezing part of the process. Those destined for bird's eye, branded individual packages went into the freezing trays that were kept at 37 degrees below zero. The bulk stuff for the government was shunted into the enormous 10 below zero cold room capable of accommodating 20 million pounds. If the peas came from nearby fields, about 2 hours passed from harvest to freezing. Working day and night in floodlit fields, Seabrook could process 1 million pounds of peas every 24 hours. Quote, "But when the pea season is over, does all of this efficient machinery stand idle?" Gardner wondered rhetorically. "By pulling a few levers and pressing a battery of buttons, it is converted for lima beans or spinach or any one of 11 other crops." That passage, while a little bit long, really stuck out to me as just something incredible. And I found myself marveling over various spaces in the book, some of which you'll hear John and I talk about in this interview, from his father's closet, which involves a dry cleaning delivery system, all the way to the descriptions of this family and John's upbringing. I think that this book is weaving together a lot of themes of things we've explored on the podcast, from the cold chain to the industrialization and mechanization of farming to, in many ways, intergenerational trauma, to how our farming system was shaped and our food system was shaped, and how it shaped us in turn. And I think that it's certainly a wild romp of a read, and I highly recommend picking it up. It is out today. I'm super grateful to John, who recorded this with me at 8 a.m. on a Friday morning. We were actually both in Vermont, but not together. And I just can't tell you what a delight it is to bring you this podcast. You know, it has been a hard 2 months for me, and a lot of things have been very murky in my life, but one thing that hasn't been is that I love bringing this to you. And so if you love these episodes and you want to support me, I am offering 2 big ways to support me financially, which are my Patreon and my Substack. There are not perks right now. You are just supporting me because you love the podcast, but perks are coming. And the other way that you can support that is totally free, and the best support that you can offer, is to leave a rating and review for the podcast wherever you listen and share it with a friend. Word of mouth is how this podcast is found, and I so appreciate it. There are links to all of that and more inside of the show notes, as well as a new section every week, which are podcast episodes that are related to the one that you just listened to. So if you love this episode and want to dig into some of the other themes I've tugged at in previous episodes, there's a list for you. And there are some 115 episodes in the backlog for you to explore. And I think many of them will surprise and delight. But without further ado, I want to welcome John Seabrook to the podcast with his book that is out today, The Spinach King, The Rise and Fall of an American Dynasty. Here's John.
Hi.
Hi,
Hey,
how are you? How are you this morning?
good. How are you this morning? Where
I'm
are
good.
you?
Oh, where I'm actually in upstate New York, so I'm right on the Vermont border. A little bit outside of Manchester, Vermont, if you're familiar.
Yeah, I'm in Vermont too, as a matter of fact,
Oh, where are you?
in South Woodstock.
Oh, we're not very far. I'm just over the border where Rupert is. That's kind of the closest tiny town.
Yeah, I don't know the area that area particularly well, but I know roughly where you are. Yeah, I'm about let's see, I'm about a half an hour, about 45 minutes from Rutland one way, and then like a half an hour from Hanover, New Hampshire the other way, and Route 4
Yeah,
Boulevard. That's the road. So where I am.
we're not very far apart at all, are we?
No, I'm not here all the time. I'm either here or I'm in Brooklyn. But I have this farm here that I inherited from my parents. So
Hmm.
I try to spend as much time here as I can.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I have a farm here as well. That's what that's what I do. I do a lot of different things, but one of them is farming.
I don't really farm any. It used to be a dairy farm. I have a
Sure.
huge red barn. Uh, Now I'm basically like a landscaping guy, like kind of like taking care of the land, and we do hay. But we don't have
Sure.
cows, so it's not really a working farm, I guess. Although I do plenty of work on it.
Yeah, well, they all require work, whether they're
Right,
working or not.
right.
That's kind of the nature of the beast.
But you gotta
Um,
like the work. I like the work. It's fun. I mean,
like the
it's good exercise. It gets you outdoors.
Yeah,
Use your chainsaw. We had a big windstorm here in early April. So there's a ton of limbs down all around the place. That's my project this weekend.
we had the same thing, and I agree that you have to like the work, and I do like the work. It's not always easy, but there's something
It's
satisfying
satisfying.
and
Yeah.
yeah, and purposeful about it.
Yes. Totally.
And that means a lot to me, but it is blood, sweat, and tears all the way down.
It actually goes very well with writing, I've got to say, because like writing
Hmm.
is a kind of formless, endless, you're not sure where you are. You
Hmm.
spend a whole day working on something you end up throwing out the next day. Whereas like,
Hmm.
farm work, it's defined. If you get it done this much this day, you can go on the next day. You don't have to like start again. And also the thinking about writing that you can do while doing farm work. It's a great way of getting your mind off of what you're working on, but like it's nice to have like thoughts pop in when you're not trying to think them sometimes.
And
And I think
shower
farm
thoughts.
that too. Yeah,
Yeah, I find many of the same things, that farming is a good place to allow passive thoughts cream to rise to the top,
that's
right?
it.
To allow some time for things to settle and for that cream to come to the top in an almost passive way, while still I'll be out there with the goats and come back to, oh, that's something that I hadn't considered.
Exactly. It's funny how your mind works that way. You have to kind of let it relax.
Mhm.
And then, as you say, the cream can rise to the top. Yeah, that's a nice way of looking at it.
I call it, with a little bit of tongue in cheek, rumination.
Yeah, let's call it rumination. Like a cow ruminating, maybe. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's kind of the funny part.
that's
It's
the
sort of
fun.
a metabolizing of all of the information into something more concrete.
Right, right. Yeah, cool.
Yeah. Um, Thank you for joining me early, and thank you for joining me at all. I'm just so excited to talk about the book and to talk to you.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for having me, kid. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Just a couple of little details. I want to make sure you don't have a hard out, just so that I respect
No,
your time.
I'm good. I'm here. I've got chores, but I don't have to do them any special time. I
I
have
have chores. I have chores too.
bark at some point, but I don't know
That's
if you.
fine. That's fine. One of the things I was going to say is everything can be edited in post. So if there's something that you want taken out, all of these things get edited
Okay.
later down the road. And then I just like to let people know I often look to the side of my screen because I have a bunch of notes and quotes
Yeah,
and
yeah.
bits from the book, and so just so you know that that's where I'm looking and why.
That's fine. Cool.
Okay. Um, because this was, I mean, and we just kind of, I'll probably even cut in some of what we just talked about because I think that talking about process is just as important sometimes for listeners. But I have to tell you, this book pulled at so many of the conversations that I've had on the podcast previously,
Hmm.
and put them into this. I mean, beautiful and hard won contextual history of your family's story. You know, we've actually talked about road building. We've talked about the cold chain. I know that you quote Nicola in the book. We've talked so much about the history of agriculture and especially of mechanization, which features so
Yeah.
fascinatingly in the book. We've even talked a little bit about DuPont's involvement with creating chemicals involved in agriculture in terms of that mylar bag.
Yeah.
And we've also talked a lot about grief and a lot about what it means to be a part of various different family structures. And so this is just it was a pleasure to see it all put together in the way that you did, and it was just a compelling and really beautiful book.
Cool. Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah. I thought we might start with farming. We already kind of started with farming because I think that, you know, this is sort of a doorway into this dynastic history that you're telling about your family that really spans from the late 1800s and into, I mean, into the 60s, 70s, but also later on. And it really covers a complete transformation of farming and the food system in general into the age of mechanization. And so I just wondered if you might speak a little bit to how, not sure, to how it was to sort of view that arc as a whole, from having a team of horses to having a team of machinery that can work through 1 million pounds of peas in a day, which I am not going to forget soon.
Yeah. You have to see the pea harvest sometime. It's still quite a spectacle. Yeah, well, the reason that I was excited about writing this book from a literary perspective and a sort of historical perspective is that my family's three generations, well, four if you start with my great grandfather, do actually kind of in a very sort of telescoped model like way reveal the transformation of the whole country from an agricultural economy to a industrial economy and then to a kind of a post-industrial branded economy.
Yeah.
And my great grandfather was the guy who grew vegetables on a 58-acre lot and was what was called a truck farmer in those days. Not because they drove trucks, because it was before trucks. The word truck is an archaic. This meaning of truck is the archaic word, like you say, I have no truck with you. It's a word for exchange, and produce was often used as exchange before currency, even in the
Oh
early
yeah.
days. So by the mid 19th century, the truck farms had kind of moved a little further away from the cities because the land had become more valuable. And South Jersey was kind of in a sweet spot because it was Philadelphia. You could get there pretty easily. Go to Camden and then take a barge across. Or New York was reachable by rail. And so that area where my great grandfather started farming was kind of in that good little sweet spot. And so he just had a little sort of, pre mechanized farm that he would drive a horse and wagon into Bridgeton, New Jersey, which is one of the big town down there, and sell the produce in the market in the morning. As he grew, he eventually started selling it in Philadelphia, but he was kind of happy with that lot. But his son, my grandfather, was far more ambitious. And so he's born in 1881. He grows up just as the country is kind of getting mechanized, and he realizes that this is the way forward in agriculture. And also inspired by not by farmers really, but by industrialists, Henry Ford in particular, who was about 20 years older than him. He built this factory in Detroit in the early 20th century. He had introduced these time motion studies and assembly line process. And my grandfather just thought, hey, why can't we apply this to agriculture? Why can't we apply this to vegetables? And if you think about it in a way, it's sort of a crazy idea because it's one thing to apply an industrial process to making cars because you know where the parts are coming from. The weather doesn't affect the parts unless there's a big flood or something. You can't get your parts. And one size is always the same size all the way down the line. Whereas with agriculture, you've got all these uncertainties involved, which are antithetical to the industrial process. You've got weather,
Mm,
you've got nature, you've got bugs, you've got all
mm.
kinds of things that can go wrong. And so, in a way, it was this sort of crazy notion that he was going to make a factory out of a farm, essentially. It's almost
Yeah,
contradiction. It feels like, right?
there's it absolutely does, and I want to get into that. And there's one funny little historical note here that, and I believe I'm not mistaken, that Henry Ford had some of his ideas about assembly line from visiting meat processing plants, from being on the kill floors in Chicago and
Oh, is that
seeing the
right? Yeah, I
way
think I've
and
read that.
seeing the way that they were breaking down these
Ah,
carcasses
interesting.
in a line. But I think what you're saying is precisely it, right? Is that the uncertainties in agriculture are incredibly resistant to industrialization. Whether you have enough water or enough sun or enough heat or too many bugs or
Right,
or too much water,
right.
uh, all of these things don't want to be mechanized. I hope you're enjoying this interview with John Seabrook and his new book, The Spinach King, which is out today. If you value the work that I'm doing here on this podcast, whether it's just these deep conversations that are being had, the topics that we're exploring, and there's some incredible topics coming up. We're going to go deep into forests, we're going to go deep into rivers, and we're going to go deep into the Nordic seaside as well. And if you want to support that, one of the best ways to support is through my Patreon or my Substack. It's a straightforward way to back this show and keep all of these important topics in the spotlight. Right now, I'm not offering any extra perks or content, just a way for you to support, but there are things that are coming soon. If you feel aligned with the conversations that I'm having here, you can find those links in the show notes. I'm so appreciative of your earballs each and every week and the feedback that I get. So thank you so much for being here. Now, back to our episode with John Seabrook.
And when he started, this was early 20th century, unbelievably, there was no irrigation in South Jersey. There was no, because it's totally flat, there was no way to use gravity to move water, and there were no pumps or to get water up into a water tower high enough. So people were totally dependent on the rain. And actually his first innovation and the thing that really sort of got him started was he discovered that there was an overhead irrigation system that was being sold by a guy named Skinner in Ohio, and you could order it with a mail order catalog, and it came in, you assembly instructions, and you assemble it yourself and on the farm, and they were overhead pipes with little holes in them that sprayed water out. And he got an electric pump, and he got one of those, and he had suddenly there was now irrigation in South Jersey where there never had been. So that was the Seabrook enterprise really began with that innovation, that technology,
Yeah.
irrigation. And if you see the symbols of the company, or if you look at the brand, even today, there's always a water tower in the iconography. And actually, on the cover of my book, there's a
Hmm.
water
Yeah.
tower too.
It's behind me.
And that's because, and if you go there and you drive toward Seabrook, the water tower is the thing you see first, this very flat landscape. It's the highest thing around. So irrigation came, and then he continued to industrialize, but it wasn't really until frozen food became viable in the early 30s, and he was charged with figuring out how to freeze vegetables for Clarence Birdseye, that the industrial process really kicked in, because now he had a technology that you could preserve the product, so he could grow it all there and freeze it there, and then he'd sort of solve the perishable aspect
Mhm.
of the whole industrial process, which is another big problem, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you got to get your product to the market. Like a car doesn't go bad
Nope.
it was right. You got to eat it pretty quickly. So frozen food was able to kind of free business from those constraints of time, and then at that point it really began to grow rapidly. And then just finish that thought. So we went from agriculture to industry, and then my father, who was the youngest of his three sons, was sort of the guy who really developed the brand after the war. His brother Courtney and he, um, and that moved the business into this sort of post-industrial phase, but actually caused a lot of conflict with his father, because for my grandfather, the factory and the land and the place and the whole vertically integrated structure was really, and all the workers who lived there,
Yeah.
was really what he considered to be the business. And a brand which could be grown and packaged in another place in California where actually labor was cheaper. What made a lot of business sense, and it was definitely the way forward, but it wasn't what he cared about. He cared about, being the big man in this place, which was
Mm.
called Seabrook, New Jersey. He didn't care about a brand. I mean, he didn't mind it, but it was a different way of doing business,
Hmm.
and that is one of the things that caused this conflict between my father and his father, which eventually caused the business to end. But we'll get to that. But anyway, so there's agriculture, industry, and then sort of post industry, and my family kind of lines up neatly in those three phases. So you can kind of take in this history, and also because it was food, it was very involved in the two wars, the
Yeah.
World War and the Great Depression. So
Yeah.
there are these major historical events that you kind of come to in this book, but you come to it through this family and the relationship between the father and the sons, and also the women in the family. Uh, and that was what I kind of was excited about writing.
And you did it deftly. I mean, as somebody who's, I mean, in agriculture, but I think that everybody will be fascinated to kind of explore uh, both historical events, the food system, and this family history that you're really telling. And I think it really, even for me, and I've been doing this for a very long time. I've been in ag my whole career, and exploring agricultural history. There were a lot of things that helped me better understand how we think about agriculture, and sort of the way that arc went in towards towards industrial and then post industrial, really. And I mean, and I think that sped up a lot too during the 70s when Earl Butz says get
Yeah,
big or get out.
yeah,
That really transformed things as
totally.
well. And how instrumental farmers were too in sort of bringing in some of modernity and including road building. I mean, that was an absolutely fascinating piece, and irrigation as really driving the need for the cold chain.
Yeah, I mean, I actually didn't know that farmers had been so instrumental in early road building
No.
either. But of course, when you think about it, it makes perfect sense because they had the machines before other people had them. They had gravel pits and materials, and they absolutely needed the roads to get their produce to market. And in muddy seasons, those dirt roads, I don't know if you see pictures of them from the old days, but they were just almost impassable. And
Yeah.
they were impassable in some seasons. And yeah, so my grandfather really and also the other thing about road building was that then you can keep your crew, your farm workers who are there during the summer season from you don't have to lay them off in the winter. You
Mhm.
can employ them through the winter, and then you don't have to look for more labor in the spring. I mean, the other big piece of this, Kate, of course, is labor and information,
Yes.
which is connected very closely to agriculture, but is its own sort of entity. And so, if you look at waves of immigrants that came to America over the late 19th and early 20th century, again, the Seabrook's farm reflects that. Like we had in the early 20th century, Italians, a lot of Southern Italians came, and then a lot of Eastern Europeans and Russians came because of the Russian Revolution. Um, then in the 30s, you had the great migration of the African Americans coming up from the South. So you had a lot of black workers coming. And then and then by the Second World basically Americans weren't going to be doing farm work for the most part, or at least Americans that had any better options. I mean, industry kind of paid better. It was indoors. It was the jobs were year round. So Seabrook, my grandfather and my father had to search further and further afield for workers, and Japanese American internees who had been rounded up and put into these camps during World War II were released to come and work at the farm. About 2,000 folks came and settled there, and then after the war, the displaced persons camps in Europe had a lot of Baltic state folks that had been driven out by Russia. And my grandfather sponsored about 600 or 700 Estonians and some other Balts to come and live and work at the farm because not only did he have the farm, he also had the housing, right? So he
Yeah.
built a whole village and more than one village. They were sort of separate villages, and he had a school that he built. Everybody paid rent to him. If they didn't pay rent, it came out of their paycheck. He controlled everything, and yeah, you either submitted to it or you didn't. But it was a farm primarily, but it was also like a whole community sort of world, really, that was self-contained. It had its own police force, it had its own, transportation. It had its own hospital, it had its own school. You never really had to leave. That was the point. You stayed and you worked.
Uh-huh.
But of course the work was really hard, and it was either outdoor work, which is we know what that's like in farming, or it was indoor in the factory, which was very loud. In the cold parts of the factory, it was very cold, or you go from like hot to cold
Mhm.
frequently from different parts of the factory. It was 12-hour shifts. A lot of these folks were getting paid, in at least during the war, the sort of minimum. They didn't pay any more than they had to. And most folks wouldn't have been doing this work if they had other options.
Yeah.
So there was a lot going on around the farm in terms of, the society, that I was also interested in getting at, because the fact that all this happened in Jersey in the 20th century, in this place that a lot of people still don't know about, and the fact that there's a museum there now, and you can go and visit it. I just kind of wanted people to realize that this amazing thing had happened in New Jersey, of all
Yeah.
places, where you don't really think of even New Jersey as being an agricultural state, really. Most people only know the refineries in North Jersey.
But
So
it's the market garden state, right? The parenthetical, the silent part of
it
that is the
was.
market garden state, that it
That's
was the
right.
home of truck farming.
That's
And
right.
and that absolutely fascinated me. And you do, and I want to touch on this too, because one of the things we've actually talked a lot about on the podcast is unions, both for manufacturing and within the food system.
Right.
And you do a really excellent job of covering, I mean, even just how fair labor standards weren't included for agricultural
That's right.
workers, and the sort of fascinating bit of leverage they had too in terms of strike, because that was different from manufacturers, because when things are ripe, they're they're ripe and they're ready to be processed, to be
That's
picked and
right.
processed.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the labor movement really was an industrial workers movement because they were in one place. A lot of the farm workers migrated from farm to farm, so you couldn't really collect dues and you couldn't really have union membership because they were not there for the time. But most farm workers were never a part of a union, and what was really sort of exciting about this project was uncovering this strike that had happened in 1934, which I actually didn't know anything about when I started it, even though it was this epic event that happened in my
Yeah.
family. But because my family didn't really behaved very well during the strike. I don't think anybody really wanted to talk about it, but it was led by African American workers, which South Jersey in those days, and even decades later, was kind of like it was basically like the Jim Crow South. I mean, it wasn't segregated by law, but it was socially segregated and residentially certainly segregated, and so for black workers to strike, and the reason they struck was because in the season, in the off seasons or in the slow seasons, they would always let the black workers go first, even though they had seniority over white workers. And so they were treated there was an unequal treatment color basically, and they just decided they weren't going to stand for it anymore. And as you say, they realized that they had leverage. Seabrook had these incredible greenhouses. This is another thing my grandfather was really innovative in. He saw that building greenhouses, even though they were a big investment, would pay off because they would be the first to market in New York with a lot of. This is long before California, or there was no interstate
Yeah.
system yet. And so he would start things in the greenhouses during the winter, during when there was still frost. Like the cabbage plants would start there, and then they would be transplanted to the field. And so there were two strikes in 1934. The first one took place right at that point where the cabbage plants had to be moved to the field, where they needed those people to do it. And then the other took place in the middle of the summer when the beet harvest was happening. Because the thing about all of this, Kate, is that even though technology industry was kind of the image of the farm, it didn't really reduce the need for labor. And in fact, it increased the need for labor because the machines could do certain things, but then they couldn't do other things. But the things they could do, they did at volume and speed, which meant that the other things you needed many, many
A lot of
hands,
people.
a
Yeah.
lot of people. So the contradiction here, yeah, this is an industrial, sort of highly mechanized, technology driven process, but in fact, it's also a giant labor camp,
Yeah.
which it was and still is in some ways the aspect
Agriculture.
of agriculture. There's just certain things that machines
Absolutely.
can't really do. They can't pick, you know, things, certain delicate fruits. They can't
No.
hoe certain wheat, you know, certain rows, you know. So anyway, so the farmers realized that the farm workers realized they had leverage and they were able to successfully, you know, strike, and they eventually did form a union, and it was the first farm workers union on the East Coast. It started in 1941. So they were incredibly courageous, and they
Yeah.
were eventually successful in what they did.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's just every piece of history woven throughout this book is incredibly compelling and fascinating in terms of and very applicable, I think, still to how we conceive of the food system and some of the problems I think it still faces.
And who
Um,
works and who does the work, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I'd point people, I just did an episode with Alice Driver, who talks about Tyson factory workers on the chicken slaughter floor and their move for to form a union. And so still to this day, very relevant. I I want to pick on, I love what you said, that CF had really built this vertically integrated farm in place and felt resistant to this post-industrial brand that was coming, and it really forms the heart of this conflict. And as you were talking, I was thinking too that this is really the inflection point where food goes from being something that really is relatively of place, relatively local, if not regional, to something that is interstate and then eventually global. And so that there's this inflection point that's happening historically that's really shifting the food system, and then within this family as it moves from industrial and this epicenter of power. And I think it's about two different structures of power as well, and how that functions. And so at the same time that there's this inflection point in, I would say, a regional food system to a globalized food system, there's this inflection point in your family.
And I'd add to that. I think what makes this particularly relevant to food, or the family brand and a food and a food product
Yeah.
is particularly intimate. Of all brands, you want to feel like there's some family or some personal element involved in your food,
Mhm.
whether it's a real family or a fake family. You think of all the different food brands that have family names, you know, Stofers or Welch's, or
Campbell's.
yeah, Campbell's. You
Yeah.
can go on and on. In the case of the Seabrooks, there actually was a real family, and the real family became kind of the brand image, and the family story became the brand narrative. So there was this kind of intimate connection between the real family and then this sort of branded family. But that actually also led to a conflict, because the real family could never really live up to the standards of the branded family. The branded family of Seabrooks were these, sort of brilliant, innovative father and his three sons, who lived this glamorous life, and also produced all these wonderful products. And if anybody wasn't sort of, any family member didn't sort of fit in consistently with that image, they were sort of criticized, ostracized, and my grandfather increasingly became, just sort of impossible to deal with on that issue. So we sort of, I think, traded some of our family values for brand values, and I feel like it came back to hurt us in some ways. It would have been maybe better just to make up a family or something, but at first they didn't want to pay. They didn't really pay for advertising the way that and also you have to remember, like the post-war food frozen food companies like Green Giant, they did create brand images. Or brand Betty Crocker from
Mm.
there were these kind of brand stories that were invented that were fictional, and Seabrook went a different direction, right? They were like, we're not going to bother with advertising agency to create a brand story for us because we've got our own brand story. And then interestingly, when my father married my mother in the 50s, Seabrook never had like a Betty Crocker of frozen vegetables, but they I guess they felt like maybe they should have one. And then I think my father thought maybe my mother was like the perfect kind of brand image of a Betty Crocker. So they even test marketed like an Elizabeth Seabrook kind of Betty Crocker like vegetable
They want to
person.
call her Lizzie, don't they? And in it, they want to call her Lizzie instead. It feels more relatable.
It feels more relatable. But if my mother knew anything about that, and I never really knew if she did, she would have hated it and she would have nixed it from the beginning. But that's sort of how the Seabrooks operated. They felt like they themselves were such an attractive and interesting family that they didn't need any other branding other than that. And then the selling point was always that we grew it and we processed it. The motto was we grow our own, so we know it's good, and we freeze it right on the spot. And so, like, unlike other companies where it might be grown one place and frozen in another place, everything was vertically integrated. Everything happened there, and you could get from the field to a frozen package within 2 hours.
Yeah.
It was like the logistics
I,
were incredible.
yeah, I pulled that the piece where you talk about the million-pound pea harvest in 24 hours as just something that logistically blew my mind.
Yeah,
Um,
like a
it,
military mission. Yeah,
yeah, I mean, just in the scale of it. I want to pick a little bit at something. I pulled this quote from you that you say over time the real family and the branded one blurred, right? Which was what you were just talking about. But I think that expectations figure really heavily in the book, and I know that your birth announcement even
yeah.
had that alliteration to "we grow our own," so we know it's good, and sort of how expectations. I think both of this fictional this you know real turned fictional brand family, but also the expectations, I think, just intergenerationally between members of your family, between CF and Jack, and later between you and your father, are expectations are it's a big piece of this.
It totally is. People, well, my grandfather had this idea of a dynasty. He had gone to I think he was trying to understand his own success in America as someone who hadn't been educated and became extraordinarily successful and owned a huge amount of land, and there was no real sort of correlative for that he knew of in America. But when he went to England, which he did in the 20s, part of his engineering company's work, he was invited to the estates of these English aristocrats, and then he sort of realized, oh, this is what I am. I'm an American aristocrat, or I have the opportunity to be like an American kind of duke, and have a great sort of estate with feudal work, sort of
Mm-hmm.
feudal workers all around it. And then he came back to America and for a number of years just sort of talked to his children about that, regularly, that they were creating a dynasty that would last for 500 years. And the son he had three sons. He trained each of them in a different aspect of engineering. The oldest was a mechanical engineer, the middle was a civil engineer, and the youngest was a chemical engineer. It's like Goldilocks and the three engineering bears or something like that. And,
Yeah.
So he very consciously, sort of planned his children's education. And he had a daughter who didn't get to work in the company at all because he was also, anti-feminist and didn't think that women should work in business, even though his daughter actually went to business school and really wanted to work
Yeah.
for the company. But yeah, so they all were brought up with this idea of what their father wanted, and I think they were willing to go along with it up to a point. But as in any family, you the children have their own ideas about how they're going to live their lives, and at some point, there's going to be a rebellion of some kind. And in fact, there were several big rebellions. Uh, it's just part of the. I mean, maybe in Europe this wouldn't be quite as much of a problem, but in America we're sort of driven by like individual realizing your
Yeah.
own, destiny.
Rugged individualism. I mean,
Rugged
manifest
individual.
destiny, baked into the fabric of early America.
Right, and then there's just a lot of sort of like psychological kind of work on actualizing yourself and realizing
Mhm.
yourself and following your dreams and not necessarily doing something just for what your father wants you to do, but what you want to do. But that didn't really work too well with the business, and it doesn't often work well in family businesses. That's often what causes
Yes.
family businesses to founder. The children just, either they have their own ideas about how to run the business or they just don't want to be in the business at all.
Yeah.
And But then you've got because it's a farm, you've got like the father and the sons in a farming enterprise. This is goes back to Adam and his children, who had a conflict too.
It's biblical.
Yeah, it was biblical. The problem with like I think with a farm, you've got and he had three sons. Who's going to inherit the farm? Who's going to get the farm? And really, it's a contest to a certain extent between
Mhm.
sons that the father kind of sets up. Show me what you can do, and if it's successful, I'll reward you with the farm. So I think that was an aspect of it too.
Yeah.
That this uncertainty of the line of succession, and my father was the youngest of the three, but was eventually sort of chosen as the successor. And that also kind of introduced some tension with the older brothers, although they did really get along pretty well. But anyway, I think it's important that the farm and the boss farmer and his sons structure is also a part of this
Mm.
story. That's kind of unique, I think, in some ways to agriculture.
It it is, and I pulled the etymology. I like etymology. I pulled the etymology for dynasty, this morning as I was kind of thinking
Oh,
about this, and it comes from the Greek dynasteia, meaning power, lordship, and sovereignty. And which,
perfect.
yep, perfect. And this is a big part of, I think, both in terms of some of the expectations that are formed, but also in terms of, I mean, and you come back to how we think about legacy and how we think about immortality. And I think that that was really a time when both your children and your business that might outlast you is part of your own bid for this sort of rugged individual mythologizing of and evading your own mortality in some ways.
And my grandfather always represented himself as like a self-made man, pulled up by his bootstraps, which is the sort
Right.
of great American part of the American dream. And it turned out that wasn't really true. This is something I kind of learned in the course of my research that his father had actually given him a pretty good start in life. His father was a pretty successful market gardener.
Mhm.
And so what he knew about growing vegetables, he actually learned from his father. And the contacts that he started out with were contacts that his father had made. Uh, but he did sort of bring the industry to the family, but he wasn't really a self-made man. Um, and but I think another thing here it's important to recognize is there long generations in my family. So 40 years between my father and his father, and almost 40 years between me and my father. And having those kind of long generations means that you really my my grandfather grew up in, he was came of age in the 1890s during the Gilded Age. Robber barons were kind of his avatars. My father came of age during the New Deal, when when totally different values were in the air. And so when the two tried to agree on matters like labor and unionization, integrating the plant, women in the workplace, my father was really just kind of like reflecting the views of the that he had grown up with, which was that yeah, we do need to make progress in these areas, and he did in fact integrate the plant. But my grandfather was outraged that there should be changes, that things should remain the same. I mean, my grandfather was essentially kind of he was an uneducated, kind of fairly ignorant man when it came to social issues. And most people of his mindset really don't get that far. But because he became very powerful, he was able to impose these, sort of racist, anti-feminine, anti-Semitic. He had all kinds of, antis this and anti that. He was able to kind of create a whole community that reflected his blinkered views. And so my father, who was an so you've also got class involved here too. So my father went to Princeton. My father was a peer of the very investment who my grandfather despised because they were elitist snobs to him, and because his company needed them to expand, and he had to give up power in order to borrow money. And he never trusted that whole community of people. Whereas my father was one of those people. He had gone to Princeton with them, he socialized with them. My father was about 8 inches taller than his father, and he was very handsome too. And so there was that as well. My father was this, sort of spectacular man and got all this attention, and then these beautiful women, he was dating in between his marriages. All of that just contributed to
Yeah.
tension between the generations. And I don't know if it was avoidable. It was just, it's part of the way our country evolved, not just in terms of agriculture to industry, but in socially, in terms of progressive values, kind of, working their way into society in the 20th century, and those that resisted them and didn't want them. There are some parallels to today, to
Yeah.
what's going on today. Anyway, so those were all sort of, I think, in the stew of the what was going on below the surface of the business.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I do. I think that this book echoes today in many different ways. Like there is a lot to be found here that is still underlying our food system, society, cultural pieces, and that makes it all the more interesting and compelling as a read. I wonder if we might zoom out momentarily and place you in the story, because you're a really big part of both the telling of the story and in the story itself. And I was thinking about, you have this little passage that I might read back to you, where you talk about Joan Didion and something that she said about journalism, because this is both your family and the family that you were inculcated in. And I think in many ways, some of the wars and conflicts and trauma that you inherited, but it's also about you as a journalist taking a very objective and unflinching look at at your family history. And so you say here, Joan Didion concludes her introduction to the nonfiction stories collected in Slouching Towards Bethlehem with one last thing to remember about the practitioners of nonfiction storytelling. Writers are always selling someone out. Whether or not the journalist is explicitly investigative, every story involves trying to get at the truth about what happened by asking questions. And sometimes that means trading on intimacy with one's subject to get the information to tell the story. A journalist has a duty to follow the story wherever it leads. Your only real loyalty is to the truth as you understand it. And I thought it was interesting because there's also a piece towards the beginning of the book where you say that ambition, energy, and ingenuity drove his rise, but violence and terror allowed him to maintain control. We often bury the details of how large fortunes are made, as the brutality underlying them is less inspiring to read about than the eureka moments of accomplishment. And
Totally. Yeah.
yeah, go, take it away.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's. So I think maybe the place to start is, this is sort of billed as a memoir, but it's really a reported memoir, and most of the
Definitely.
memories are take place before I was born. Most of the action in the book takes place before I was born, so it begins with me and my father, and then I'm wondering about things about our relationship that I don't really understand, and then the the return to the past is by way of trying to sort of come to a better understanding of that. But you're absolutely right that writing about your family and doing kind of investigative reporting into your family is a very strange. It's a
Yeah.
very trippy, mind-bending experience. Particularly in my case, because I didn't know a lot of this stuff when I signed up. I mean, I always kind of thought I would write my family story, and I knew some of it, or at least I thought I knew some of it. But then when I actually kind of committed to writing the book, and I started to investigate, and another important aspect there is that the internet during that period had digitized all these local newspapers from South Jersey and elsewhere that you never really would have been able to turn up in a library or in a microfilm search. They just weren't recorded in the New York Public Library or in wherever you were doing your research. But newspapers.com eventually got all these newspapers, and you could search. You could search Seabrook, the Millville Daily, and you would get daily coverage of events at the farm. And that was how I uncovered the strike, and then that sort of almost hour by hour account of what happened during the strike, and then the role that my family played in the strike. My uncle, I discovered, had run one of the strikers over with. Didn't kill him, but injured him. Another of my uncles threw a tear gas bomb into a worker's home. These were people I admired and loved. They were gone by the time I discovered this stuff. But it was like very, very hard to sort of reconcile men that I remembered and knew, and these kindly, decent men with the actions that they took during the strike, and then the question of whether I should tell people about this stuff. Again, I think the fact that 40 years of generations, the fact that they're all gone and long gone in most cases, was definitely a factor. If I had been a lot closer in terms of years, and if some of them had still been living, I think it would have been much more difficult to do. Not because I would sort of feel like I was betraying them for doing it, but just because it would upset them, and it didn't seem worth it at the time. It was just sort of better to wait until I'm basically the older generation, and I can tell the story for my children, right? Like,
Yeah.
because I want my children, and I have a black child, so I have two children. One of them is adopted from Haiti, so which I write about in the book,
Mhm.
and I don't want them. to grow up thinking that their family did these terrible things that no one has ever really apologized for or tried to reconcile or tried to make better. And in particular, the African American part of the story, the whole all the migration stories, people coming up from the Jim Crow South had never been part of the institutional history of Seabrook Farms, was not reflected at all in the museum that's down there. And I think one of the things I'm proudest and maybe the most happy thing I feel about this book is that their stories are, particularly their actions during the strike, are now known to
Yeah.
people. And in fact, it's kind of inspired a lot of the descendants of those people who live down there in South Jersey to now start really collecting oral histories from their family
Mm,
members. And that's an ongoing project. And the
mm,
Mellon Foundation has now made money available to create monuments around the state of New Jersey to migrant workers who came, whether it's the cranberry fields in sort of mid Jersey, or the mills and factories up in North Jersey, or the fields down in South Jersey. All of these migrant workers that came up from the South or from other places are now going to be memorialized, for what
yeah.
they did. I'm very pleased if my book has directed some of the attention away from the accomplishments of just my family and showing how they couldn't have done it without the
Yes.
workers. The workers were really, yeah, we talked a little earlier. They were just an essential part of this whole enterprise, and yet, it's
Yeah.
as you say, it's or as I say, I guess it's like the eureka moments that business histories tend to celebrate. And also, yes, being an insider, telling the story of a successful American family that kind of realized the American dream from the inside, I think is a fairly unique perspective. And,
Very.
and it turns out that some of the myths that we associate with the American dream, oh, big surprise, are not really true.
No.
People cut corners. My grandfather represented himself as this bootstrap guy who played by the rules. He didn't play by the rules. He cheated. He took shortcuts. He lied. There were a lot of things that made him successful that aren't included in the American dream mythology. And so I was in a position to tell that stuff. And yeah, it is difficult to tell these stories about your family, but I feel like it's for the living that I'm writing, really, not for
Mm,
they don't care. Whatever.
yeah.
I don't think they care. But living Seabrooks and others who might learn from the story are important. So
Yes.
I feel like it's the right thing to do to tell this stuff.
Yes. I mean, I really appreciate that this book is for the living. And I think, we've touched several times on how relevant I found the book to be to a lot of the problems that we face today, still, and kind of being a bit of a cautionary tale. And I think also, I mean, in many ways, the history of America is the history of mythologizing. Uh, we are myth makers in terms of the stories that we have chosen to tell ourselves about this country and about the people in it, and that goes a long way, whether it's the myth of the wilderness, which never really was. It was tended by indigenous people,
Right.
and there really was no frontier as it was sold to what it means to rugged individually bootstrap a business and create that sort of power. um yeah, I think there are a lot of ways in which we are mythologizers.
I mean, another interesting thing about this is that the workers who came to Seabrook Farms, particularly the Japanese American workers and the Estonians, really did mythologize my grandfather because in their stories,
Mm,
he represented the good American. Like the
mm,
Japanese Americans had been rounded up by FDR's Executive Order 9066. And, you know, these were very patriotic Americans, the Japanese American community, and they had been trampled on and literally like confined to concentration camps essentially. So for them, the fact that my grandfather was able to sort of get them out of those situations and into Seabrook Farms, he figures as this kind of great humanitarian savior, you know, in their family
interesting.
stories. And likewise with the Estonians, he literally did personally sponsor these folks, so they became Americans thanks to him. And so they have this sort of mythology
Hmm.
built up around and he encouraged that because of course he liked it and also helped with the work. But the reality of the situation was he wasn't that man at all. He was a, as I say, he was a bigot, he was racist, he was an anti-Semite, he was a white supremacist. He created a world in which white Protestant men ran everything. People of color were denied equal rights. Women weren't given, work, and everything was
Yeah.
and even though you hear about the sort of multicultural aspect Seabrook, and it's true, and it's certainly a important part of the story that there are all these different cultures and people and languages. There are 26 different languages spoken on the farm at one point. But the reality is that they all were contained within this highly segregated and power driven community that they had really very little rights at all.
Yeah.
They were there. They lived where they were told to live, and that was with people of their same color, really. And
Sure.
the people of lighter skin were always given better housing than the people with darker skin. So, so you've got like, yeah, the superstructure of this American dream, but if you look within, it's actually sort of a nightmare of
Mhm.
oppression and repression and stuff that's also part of America, very much a part of
Very
America.
much.
Kind of goes back to the South, really, and pre-slavery. So there's just these if you want to sort of compare it to today, there are these currents in American politics. I think America maybe is sort of ultimately being a kind of, it was founded as with progressive ideals, at least for white property owners. And we think of America as sort of trying to move toward like, the arc of the universe bends toward justice.
Mhm.
But in fact, there's this undercurrent of illiberal values and deeply sort of reactionary values that doesn't want the world to be that multicultural, doesn't want women to have the power that they should have, and wants to rewrite history to show that as we're doing now under the Trump administration, to show that white people really were the ones that were the heroic builders of this country, and that business should be able to do whatever they want. Businessmen, tech bros, they should have a free hand, just like my grandfather had a free hand, because what they do creates growth, and then growth benefits everyone. That's the sort of the
Well,
idea.
yeah, that's the idea.
And so it's like these ideas don't disappear. They kind of
No.
remain on. And one of the interesting things about this book is really to see how these ideas actually coalesced into a whole community, what that
Mhm.
community was like, and then how it kind of ended, because those ideas produced kind of hatred, unrest, and then corruption that sort of festers and comes in between the relationships between the family members involved, and ultimately people don't trust each other and they lie to each other, and the business eventually falls apart because of that. So it's kind of an instructive tale of we as a country. I don't know where we're going, but I can tell you where Seabrook went with some of these values, and it wasn't to a very good place. Um,
Yeah.
so that was another reason for writing the book and for writing it now. I think
Yeah.
it kind of was the right time for this.
Yeah. I mean, I really felt that, and I think that there's, and I think a lot about how we're inculcated in all of these different layers of culture, right? Like we're sort of inculcated in our family and our family's view and the way of doing things. And then there's sort of, there's another level of sort of the more immediate culture that surrounds that. And always teasing apart that culture is a part of the word agriculture.
Right.
And then there's sort of more of these sort of national values, right, or American values, these stories that were inculcated in that we then sort of propagate. And to draw to draw a parallel in the book here, I thought a lot about, I don't know if you've read any, have you read any Gabor Mate? I think you
I don't think I have. Have I?
I think you might like his work. I threw it on the shelf, but how our family trauma is inherited. And I'll say this too, that your story really resonated with me in terms of some of the habits and views that I inherited from deeply hurt people, right? And Gabor Mate has this: we pass on to our offspring what we haven't resolved in ourselves. And I kept
Uh,
coming back to that for me, for you, and then maybe more also as a culture writ large. I think that is true, that there's this generational trauma that we're inheriting.
and that's so interesting. This book begins with my father leaving me this box of documents that was essentially like a box of trauma.
Yes.
Like you, if you couldn't like box up more trauma that suffered from one's father than was in this box, and it was all this stuff that I'd never heard. My father had never talked about it, but when I got into it and read it, he was so deeply traumatized by his father that it had serious effects on his soul, really. Like when your father seems to hate you and your father does everything he can to destroy you, like how do you even live with that? And yet he compartmentalized, he went on to have success after things with his father. Uh, but it obviously the trauma was in there somewhere, and so writing the book became for me partly a way of understanding my father as the victim of his father, not as like
Yeah.
the successor or like the nepo baby of his father, but as basically his victim. Uh, how that had affected our relationship and how he had, been as a father, having had the world's worst. I mean, maybe not the world's worst, because the guy had some qualities, but he treated him so badly. Particularly, I mean, there does seem to have been a medical event that occurred when my grandfather was in his 60s. And then there was also, I discovered a lot more alcohol involved in the story than I realized, and also phenobarbital
Yeah, the phenobarbital. Yeah.
that I didn't realize either. But I think he just kind of really just became a just a raging, drug addicted terror, and took it out mainly on my dad. And yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly how that stuff got passed on to me, but I do know that I had to do a lot of work on it. And alcohol, I write about my own addiction to alcohol in the book, um, and therapy that I sort of work through to try to understand how the family legacy had impacted me, even though I'm not in the business at all. But you are still part of this family business, even if you're not in the business, because you were brought up thinking that you would be, and the mythology of the whole sort of dynasty thing is somehow there in your head. And my father named me John M. Seabrook Jr. and kind of wanted me to be him, really. And I just was never really him. If anything, I took after my mother, who was a journalist,
Hmm.
who was a total outsider, who came from South Dakota. And I think her perspective was the perspective that I basically had toward my family. As I felt like kind of an outsider, and I wanted to sort of understand them. But at the same time, I also was a part of the family, and I inherited this stuff that I didn't even know I had, kind of,
Yeah.
but that was there, and eventually kind of tried to deal with it toward the end of the book,
Yeah.
when it kind of comes. That's the sort of the memoir part. Like,
Hmm.
it eventually does become kind of a personal memoir. And it's really about that, is sort of trying to deal with the inherited family structure and make it work in my life and with my children.
Yeah. I really appreciated the memoir component of this, and appreciated the vulnerability with which you approached it, because I think that, whether or not you come from a more dynastic or a big family with this, I think that a lot of us have inherited some of these internal wars of our parents. I came back to a piece that you had about doing parts work, which I've also done, doing internal family
Oh,
systems and
cool.
parts
Oh,
work.
you've done
Um,
IFS?
yeah, yeah, I've done
Awesome.
IFS, and I think it's fantastic, and so I love
That's
that you
great.
you drew attention to that. And you said, I was part of the family system that had built Seabrook Farms, but also destroyed it. The war over the business was still going on inside of me as a battle of parts. And just so how much I think that trauma gets passed down generation to generation, which is the work of Gabor Mate, is really exploring how trauma is inherited.
I got to read
Um,
that about this, clearly.
um, the myth of normal is what I think I would recommend starting with,
Okay.
and how addiction too is passed down. And I mean, I'm the child of alcoholics that had an alcohol problem myself in my 20s, right?
Oh,
And
wow.
and that just recurs on. And so I really appreciated you sharing that, because I think that while your family's story is quite different, than many family stories, it's also very much the same.
I mean, the alcohol thing in my family it wasn't just like drinking for the sake of drinking. It was all caught up in class and aspiration and wanting to show that we had acquired these sort of civilized traits. And everything had to happen in a hurry in my family. Like, because basically from my grandfather to my father, we sort of went from, you know, it was almost like three generations or four generations packed into two, in terms of starting out as an uneducated farm boy, and then the next generation is a Princeton graduate, and so alcohol, like particularly wine, and
Mhm.
learning about wine, knowing about wine, that became my family's kind of proof that we'd risen in the world, and knowing what cocktails to order at the right time and knowing how to make them. And it was never like spoken of as alcohol because we love to drink alcohol, even though maybe that was the ultimate reason for it. It was kind of like, here we are living this kind of high life of people who have made it in the world, and or
Mhm.
and clothes were another part of that too.
Oh god, the closet. I mean, the I here I am stumbling over my words. The clothes and the closet. That passage is just, again, another passage that I will not soon forget. This dry cleaners carousel and
Right,
the hundreds of
right.
suits.
Right. Like, it was crazy that this was part of this whole kind of, we are English, we were sort of aristocrats in the British royal family mold. And so we're going to dress like that. And so I think, for my father, it was still like, Edward, he resigned the monarchy for Wallis Simpson, his wife, was sort of the fashion plate of those times. And the tailors were, British Savile Row tailors. And so my grandfather first, and then my father just had these incredible wardrobes. And then my father took it so far that he actually had to have this dry cleaners apparatus installed in the house so that he could like pick the suit that he wanted for the right occasion. And if you get into the book, you'll see like a whole classification system, and they were all numbered, and he could push a button and get that suit for that particular occasion. And yeah, and then the third thing. So there was wine, there were clothes, and then for my father, the ultimate was there were carriage driving, horse-drawn carriages that basically is the sport of kings. It really, not that many families who are not a royal family do this for a reason because it's incredibly expensive. And but it was his image of himself, this man sitting on they call the box seat with four horses. And again, it's sort of interesting that my grandfather started out on a farm where it was horse-drawn
Mhm.
power. This tells you something about the way kind of class works in
Oh
America.
yeah.
That for my father, horses were an entirely recreational pastime that you really had to, be kind of an aristocrat to afford. My grandfather always hated horses because horses represented the past, the industrial age, everything he was trying strive to get away from. And he got rid of all the horses on the farm very early. By 1920, they were all gone, and so there's this kind of return to horse life, but only through this kind of very aristocratic pursuit of carriage
Mm.
driving. So I don't know, that's a footnote on American class and
Mhm.
how it evolves and how we
Mhm.
kind of sort of fetishize certain aspects of
Mhm.
our past and reinvent them as different signifiers, but also do connect, I think, to the past. And for my father, I think having horses did connect to the farm, and he was born in 1917. There were still horses around. So there was a certain continuity there, but there was also a transformation there. Anyway, so yeah, those three aspects of sort of material life, wine, clothes, and horses, became a huge part of how the Seabrooks kind of define themselves in the world, and how people saw them and understood them, and really just they invented it themselves. Like they were self-invented. This isn't the Gatsby kind of
Yes.
story. It's like, where do these people come from? How did they get this way? If you look into it, you'll find that they very consciously manufactured this life for themselves. But to the casual outsider, they seem like they've been born that way, right? And they were always that way, it's just that's America. That's America for you.
Yeah, I mean, I pulled into my notes manufactured this life for themselves, and I couldn't help but think as you were talking that there's a bit of a metaphor in this this closet, this dry cleaner's carousel of clothes that your father has. After his death, I know a few pieces I think went to the Smithsonian, but for the rest, you could barely give them away. And I think that almost belies that facade that is manufactured, and what's beneath it is impermanent, right? Like there's this idea that that dynasty is going to happen, that this will be immortality, and the truth is that it, it isn't.
And you're left with all this stuff that, like, without the person who was the dreamer, the animator of those suits or those horses, the person that actually kind of gave it the image that made sense, is gone. And now it's just, yeah, it's just well, a lot of stuff that actually people don't really need or want or want that much. It was kind
Yeah.
of like my father had all these like handmade British heavy kind of woolen suits made for like drafty English country houses before central heating, uh, and he always looked like $1 million in them. But when I tried to get used clothes sales stores, secondhand stores, even the high end ones, even they didn't have a brand. They weren't like Prada. They weren't Dolce and Gabbana. They were connected to other values that weren't really brand related, but were maybe pre-brand related, and no one really wanted them. So yeah, and a couple of the more elaborate pieces, the coaching things went to the Costume Institute actually at the museum at the Metropolitan Museum, and then I had a number of friends my size, so I was able to like give them each a suit. We had them tailored, and we had a picture taken with us all together, which I have in my house, which I look at almost every day. Uh, and but yeah, the rest of them, some guy came, took them off my hands, claiming he was a haberdasher, but I think he just like kept the wardrobe for himself. And now he's that guy walking around somewhere with these suits on, pretending he's a British aristocrat. Um, yeah, so
Hmm.
funny.
Yeah, I was struck when you were talking, that all these things that people don't want. And I wonder, as you reflect on this process of writing this book, if we're at a point where we can look at the stories that we've been telling ourselves, whether that's within a family or within a culture or a country writ large, and begin to ask ourselves, are there things we don't want here? And how might we tell a different story? Because you said, this book is really for the living, in many different ways, both the living Seabrooks and the people that were a part of the the workers that were a part of Seabrook, and I think their children, but also for, I think, for people who see some parallels to our modern era in this. So I guess I'd ask you, as you reflect on writing this book, like, is there an opportunity for us to start telling ourselves new stories?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of us are still kind of burdened by the past and where our families came from. Because for a lot of us, those struggles that our family went through as immigrants, or as people without much in terms of material possessions, are told us to remind us that we need to honor those folks, and stay true to some sort of set of values that we believe they represent. And I understand the reason for that, and particularly if you come from an agricultural community. If you grew up on a farm and your parents were farmers and your and farming is still very much of a family oriented business. That there's sort of a good reason for wanting to conserve. Well, you want to conserve the land and you want to conserve your life and the life that's based on the land, but you also want to conserve the legacy of the people that built that. But I think you then excuse a lot of the things that they did, and the ways that they were able to become successful, or even if they weren't, and they weren't successful, but their their methods of working and of interacting with the world are just not your values anymore. They're partly because of the times have changed, partly because you're just a different person. You had a different experience growing up. I mean, my mother really took it upon herself to sort of inculcate a lot of the values that ended up in the book. She always had a very sort of Westerners pioneer sort of view of my family. she saw them as being, kind of East Coast aristocrats, and part of a society that her people had left. Her people
Yeah.
had gone from Brooklyn to South Dakota during the when there was still, the frontier was still open, and they left that society behind because they wanted to make their way in the world, and the East Coast didn't really seem to give them the opportunities that the West did. So I think my mother kind of brought a lot of those kind of pioneer Western values into our family, and she was quickly kind of submerged in the Seabrook world. But I got them. I picked up on those values, and because that's the way families work. Stuff that's maybe not on the surface of the family. Because the Seabrook stuff is very much on the surface, but my mother, the Toomey, the sort of Irish Catholic side of things, was not on the surface, and but it was inherited by me, and so I guess I just kind of have a different. Or I wanted to reconcile my mother's views with like what my family legacy was in a way that she, I think, even though she hated it when I wrote about the family, in a way that my father didn't. Like, because I did write some of this stuff when my family was alive, when my parents were alive. First piece of this, although it was long before I knew the real story, appeared in the New Yorker, like actually 30 years ago. And a couple of other pieces appeared of like the kind of prequels. I didn't even know there was a book yet, but my father always sort of liked those stories because he had always sort of sold himself to the press as sort of this guy that they should be written about, and so he was kind of satisfied with that. But my mother she just never liked the memoir stuff. She never liked me writing about my family or myself. As I say in the book, it's possibly because she knew what I was going to find out, that
Yeah.
I didn't know, that she did know. Because she came into the family in 1956, right when things were just falling apart. So she had never seen the building up of it, and she never really knew my grandfather at any other time, except when he was in this kind of raging, crazy mode of the 50s, and it was, and she just didn't know what to make of it at all. Like she thought, oh, the Seabrooks is this wonderful family. I'm so blessed to be becoming a part of it, and it turned out to be full of these absolutely insane people, right? And so she quickly got like her mind got blown by that, and then when everything fell apart in 1959, we moved away from Seabrook to a town about 18 miles away, which doesn't seem that far, but
Wow.
really was like a wholly different community. And so,
Yeah.
like, I grew up, knowing something had happened because my father had been disowned by his father, and sort of met my grandfather once, but it was under very strange circumstances, which I write about in the book. And but I never knew really what the story was. And no one really wanted to tell me the story because I was the kid that, like, they were sort of scandalous, and I was a Seabrook, and nobody really felt like I should. They wanted to talk about it. And so I was constantly just kind of wanting to know more.
Yeah.
And actually, before I became a writer, this is long before I thought about being a writer, and probably it's the reason I became a writer, is because I just wanted to. I had all these questions about, like, wait,
Hmm.
like, whole thing, what happened to it? Where,
Yeah.
no
Wow.
one's talking about this. And but people don't want to talk about that stuff really. And my mother, I think, kind of had. She was the key for me to kind of want to kind of ask questions. And the fact that she had been a journalist, also was an important part of why I began asking these questions.
Yeah, I mean, even the journalism and the writing itself feels like something that is shaped very much by your family on multiple levels, by your
It
mother, the
is,
journalist, but also by those questions that you were holding so close at heart.
for sure.
And to ask those questions, to look at structure, and to ask to ask how power happens too. I mean,
Right.
this is very much a book exploring that, and I'm so glad that you decided to write this book and to make that big decision to delve into that box that your father left you. Um, have I missed anything big that you wanna touch on before we kind of wrap up?
We've covered quite a lot of ground here. Yeah, I mean, I think I will just on my mother. We didn't really talk about how they met or anything, but I think this is significant too. Yeah, so my father kind of seduced journalists. Like journalists really liked him
Mhm.
because he was very charming and as I said, handsome, funny, kind of funny. I mean, he was at least sort of clever, and and he got all this great press, right? And so and my mother was she come from South Dakota. She first come to Washington D.C. during and were away, and women could get work in journalism that they couldn't get before. And then she proved that she was such a colorful writer, she was given a column in the at UP at United Press, and had it was syndicated, and so in it. One of her sort of big scoops in early 1956 was she broke the news that Grace Kelly was going to marry the prince Monaco, uh, and which was like one of the biggest stories of the year, first big televised event of our time,
Sure,
uh,
interesting, sure, yeah.
that everybody kind of watched at the same time and knew about. My father, the Kellys and the Seabrooks had gone back to Jack Kelly, who was Grace Kelly's father, was a contractor in Philadelphia and built the plant, the Seabrooks power plant, and this incredible phallic smokestack that rose above it. And so my family knew the Kelly family, and so when Grace decided to get married, my my father was invited to cross the Atlantic on the ship that the Kellys took the wedding party and members of the prince from New York to Monte Carlo on. And my mother, as a member of the press, was invited to go on the ship, as to cover the wedding. And so here they never met, but here they were on this ship, heading toward, the wedding of the century.
Yeah.
And my father really is there partly because it's good for the brand. It's going to be great publicity for Seabrook Farms, and so he, of course, his practices as usual, seduce the journalist, like at least figuratively seduce the journalist. But in this case, it actually became literal, and they had this romance kind of parallel to the romance going on in Monaco, and then they got married about 4 months later. Um, so even my parents' relationship was kind of born out of this like seeking of publicity, really, by my father and charming journalist into kind of telling his story. And when my mother first started coming down to visit, she was doing it as a columnist. Really, she thought she would get out of this crazy lifestyle with a top hat and the horses. And if you look at the cover of the book, the picture there is the very first time my mother came to. to visit South Jersey, and my father's the one in the top hat. My mother's sitting next to him, not wearing a hat, which is a really terrible
Oh, yeah, it's
violation.
social faux pas.
It's a horrible, and her chaperone friends who she brought along with her are also not wearing hats, and
Yeah.
and that was the beginning of my mother. My mother, even though she was a very independent woman, was also sort of cowed by the sort of lifestyle that she was marrying into, and desperate to not commit social faux pas. She was very sort of anxious about not having the right thing to wear. And even though she had interviewed stars and famous people, she was very sort of socially insecure around my father's friends. And so I think it was partly the reason that she kind of embraced the Seabrook, not only the lifestyle, but the story and the mythology, was because she really wanted to assimilate. She really wanted to belong and not stick out.
Mm,
But I don't think she ever really bought it.
yeah.
But she just kind of acted it. But as you were saying earlier, this is the way families work. Like the unrealized dreams or ambitions of the parent become absorbed into the sort of psychological makeup of the children and eventually work their way out through the children. And I kind of feel like that really was where this story ultimately came from. Was, yeah, it was my family, but my mother was the way in, or like
Mm,
the person that I took after, that allowed me to see this from the outside a little bit,
yeah.
as well as being an insider and being a part of it.
Yeah. I mean that there was some piece of that that she passed on to you.
Right,
Yeah. I mean,
exactly.
and I love that
That
piece that
column that
you're
she never wrote, sort of like the
yeah.
column that she came down
Mm,
to write, eventually became this book, I
mm,
think.
mm. Yeah, I mean, I'm struck. I'm really struck, and I picked Gabor Mate back up after this because I was struck, in I mean, just what you said right there, right? That our parents' unfulfilled hopes and expectations sometimes, dreams sometimes, some are something that I think we often are working towards realizing or working through their trauma, and I think it's an incredible thing too to do that, to kind of, there was a came back to a quote. I was recording a podcast about fire in the West, and about kind of the mythologizing of the American wilderness, as I alluded to earlier. And in it, he's sitting with this indigenous man, and he says, a circle is the strongest shape, but it's also the hardest one to break. And I was thinking about that in terms of generational cycles, and to break that, and to be able to give your kids something different. Not that it doesn't come with all of its own other stuff too, but yeah.
That's interesting. I like that. The circle is the hardest thing, the shape to break. Yeah.
Yeah, strongest shape, but also the hardest
Strongest,
one to break. And I think that
strongest shape to break. Yeah.
those cycles, whether they're cultural or whether they're familial,
Yeah.
um, become become very difficult to
Yes.
to overcome. But I love that you brought this piece in about what your mother gave you.
Cool.
And yeah. Um,
Great.
Anything else, John? I mean, I think the book is fantastic, and what I want is for people, as you tell this story about the wedding in Monaco, about Grace Kelly and Prince Rainier. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. In Monaco, there are so many stories nested in this book that are just absolutely fascinating, compelling, wild beyond belief. Whether it's closets, or the production of peas, or
Right.
or some of these stories about weddings, or Eva Gabor.
Right, Ava Gabor. Who knew?
Yeah,
Ava
yeah. Who
Gabor,
knew?
Green
Who knew?
Acres. All of that. The other thing, Kate, I guess I should mention here is that the images, the photographs that exist, that some of them are in the book,
Mhm.
amazing because the family. This is one of the things that the company was very aware of: image building from an early point. And the
Yeah,
farm had a staff photographer. Like even in the 1910s and
it's wild.
1920s, they had staff photographers photographing all the machines. There's also this amazing. You can find it on YouTube. This amazing. They were one of the first buyers of the Ford Sun tractor, which was really like Ford's first tractor. And Ford came to Seabrook and filmed like a squadron of these tractors plowing the fields in 1920, which is absolutely fascinating. Also, because it was food and because the government bought a lot of the food and
Mhm.
during war, the and also because during the 30s, the government employed many of the country's best writers and photographers to go around writing about places that were affected by the Great Depression. Like first-rate photographers were there in the 1930s when the strike was going on to capture these extraordinarily some of them very, very horrifying images of men being put into chokeholds and the KKK, the New Jersey. Who knew the New Jersey KKK was so active in the 30s? But then in the 40s, photographers came and photographed the plant. And all of those photographs are like in the National Archives. They're freely available. And then because, the wedding and everything, my mother's, even though, it was Grace Kelly they were taking pictures of, my mother was in those photographs because she was covering great. Or there's this
Yeah.
fantastic photograph of Marilyn Monroe with my mother like just behind her because she was working on a story about Marilyn Monroe. So I think what's kind of special about this book is, it's a pretty amazing story, but then you have these photographs that actually document a lot of that story. So you can kind of you can have like kind of this parallel visual experience. There's a 24-page photo insert, and then there's photos in front of each section of the book.
Mhm.
So and then there's a lot more online. The New Jersey Digital Highway, if people are interested, has thousands of photographs from Seabrook Farms, and as I say, the National Archive. So there's this was an extraordinary aspect of this story is that even though I wasn't there for most of the story because I wasn't born, everything was so visually documented that I could really put myself there. I could see it.
Yeah.
I was able to kind of create these scenes that had happened long before I was born, just through these amazing photographs. So that's another, I think, cool thing about this book, and it was a cool thing about working on the book is that I had all this material available.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and I'll say this too, it reads in a very fiction-esque way. I mean, I'll echo Nicola Twilley, who said, it was the Succession, but for
Just spin.
spinach, or a sort
Right,
of Yellowstone,
right,
but for vegetables
right.
instead of cattle,
Yeah.
and so it's a very, I mean, it's a very engrossing story. And then to have I just have the ARC copy, but I'm excited to get my hands on
Oh
the
yeah.
finished product to see those photo inserts.
Oh yeah, 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 totally. Yeah, you should get, I'll get the publisher to send you one. Yeah, you should
Okay,
have
yeah,
one.
that'd be neat. That would be neat.
Yeah.
Um, John, I'm so appreciative of the book. I can't wait to share it with people, and I have notes here for everything you just mentioned, and we'll link to those in the show notes. We'll link to the New Jersey Digital Highway photographs and some of the stuff from the National Archives, and I'm going to look up that Fordson tractor. I mean,
I'll send
and
you a link. I'll send you a link when we get off.
okay,
I'll send you a
um,
link to that. And I'll
because
also
I mean, even just during the pea harvest, I mean, 150 tractors for this 1 million pea. I still can't
it was
picture it.
like
And I've
D-Day.
spent time, yeah, I've spent time on pretty big farms, and I can't even fathom that.
Yeah, there's an incredible account of the pea harvest in 1943 that was written up in one of the magazines. and that also includes this incredible anecdote of how like the the steam because they needed steam to blanch the
Yeah.
vegetable process. This turned out to be the part that Clarence Burns, who invented the quick freezing process, couldn't figure out that you needed to actually kind of blanch them first and then freeze them because otherwise the cells would explode. That
Hmm.
so they had like this huge steam capacity, but in the middle of the harvest, the steam the boiler broke down, and they had no more steam, and they had all these trucks lined up, and they called my grandfather, who was in Utah at the time, and he said, look, just back up one of the locomotives and hook the steam, intake valve up to the locomotives, and it worked, and they produced steam with these locomotive trains until they could get the plant back online. So incredible stuff.
Wow. I think during the intro I might read this passage about the 1 million peas. I mean, because it
It's
is
pretty
just,
amazing.
yeah, it is pretty incredible. And I think it also belies, we often don't consider what it takes to bring food to market at scale, and it belies some of that scale that's very, very hidden from us, even even in 1943, right, which was a very different
Yeah.
time than now. Thank you so much for the book, and I'll have links to the book and to your website as well, and for taking the time with me early in the morning farming
Yeah.
hours
Good
for
farming
a
hours.
podcast recording. I really
They
I
were
really
milking the
appreciate
cows.
that. Yeah. Well, yeah, actually there are goats that might
Okay.
appreciate being milked at some point, but they'll be fine.
Okay.
um
Good.
I put them on hold this morning. um but I just really, the book is fantastic. I can't wait to share it with everyone.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Kate. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll be in touch with Kyle when this comes out, and
Okay.
it'll go out to big newsletter, social media, all the places. And I'll tag you where that's appropriate, and just get with Kyle on that front.
Cool. Great. Well,
Okay.
so nice talking. I really
Yeah.
appreciate your interest,
Yeah.
and your life story sounds pretty interesting too.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Yeah, there was some small parallels there for me that were really interesting to explore, and yeah, it was part of why I appreciated you including that memoir aspect and sharing of yourself.
All
Yeah,
right.
and if
Well,
you ever find yourself in Rupert, you can
yeah, you're
shoot me
not
an
too
email.
far. So,
Yeah.
but I'll keep really an easy one to remember. So if I'm definitely if I'll send you an email or text, and maybe
Yeah.
we can say hi.
Yeah, I would love that. I think that's great. And I don't
Cool.
know
Nice of you up here
if
this
you're
way.
you should go to Northshire. Northshire Bookstore in
Yeah.
Manchester. I don't
Yeah.
know. You should go chat there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll get in touch with them because I want to do some stuff up here.
Yeah, if
Instead
you
of
do
doing.
stuff up here, please let me know. I'll come.
Okay. All right. Well, that's great. Yeah. I think I might do. There's a big book event in Woodstock. It was a little early this year for the book, but it's called Bookstock. But next year, I'm definitely going to do something at that. And so, yeah, maybe I'll get in touch with Northshire and see if they want to host a book reading, book signing type thing.
Yeah, I think that's great. I'll mention it to them too. I've mentioned
Yeah,
a couple
please
of
do.
people because I like seeing the authors I get to talk to in person, and
Yeah.
so I often kind of send them like, hey, you should do this, so they know me. And yeah, please keep in touch.
Okay. I will.
Okay,
All right.
thanks, John. Have a great
Have a
rest of
great
your day.
rest of your day. Bye,
Okay,
Kate. See you
bye.
later. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. If what you found resonated with you, may I ask that you share it with your friends or leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts? This act of reciprocity helps others find Mind, Body, and Soil. If you're looking for more, you can find us at groundworkcollective.com and at Kate_Kavanaugh, that's KATE_KAVANAUGH on Instagram. I would like to give a very special thank you to China and Seth Kent of the band All Right, All Right for the clips from their beautiful song Over the Edge from their album The Crucible. You can find them at All Right, All Right on Instagram and wherever you listen to music.